The small town of Millersville was draped in an eerie quiet, only disturbed by the howling wind that swept across the empty streets. The sky, overcast and dark, was painted with a thick blanket of snow. It was one of those nights when the world felt as if it had stopped, frozen in time, with the temperature plummeting well below freezing. The town, normally bustling with activity, was deserted as everyone huddled inside their homes, trying to escape the relentless cold. But not everyone was inside, for K9 Officer Rex, a German shepherd with striking blue eyes, was out in the storm, standing watch outside Officer Emily Carter's home. Rex's thick fur coat rippled with the chill as his muscles tensed against the cold. He had been trained to stand guard, to protect and to serve, but on this night, the young officer's canine companion felt an unusual sense of urgency. His nose twitched in the biting wind as it caught a faint scent, one that didn't belong on this frozen street. Rex's sharp ears perked at the sound of a soft whine. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. He turned his head, his eyes narrowing as the sound grew louder, a pleading cry in the distance. There was something out there, something in trouble. Without a second thought, Rex abandoned his post at the front door of Emily's house and bounded towards the alley where the noise came from. His feet kicked up snow as he moved swiftly, every muscle in his body honed from years of training and experience. As he neared the alley, Rex's keen senses told him something was terribly wrong. The wind carried the scent of fear, of something fragile, something helpless. And then he saw them. Two tiny, trembling shapes huddled together at the base of a dumpster, their fragile bodies nearly lost in the thick blanket of snow. Their fur was matted and dirty, their small forms shivering violently against the cold. The puppies were only a few weeks old, far too young to be alone in such harsh conditions. Rex's instincts kicked into overdrive. His heart, though he had no words to express it, ached for these defenseless creatures. They were not meant for the bitter cold, not meant to be abandoned to die alone in the storm. Rex moved cautiously toward them, careful not to startle the puppies, whose fearful eyes blinked up at him through the snow. Their shivering intensified as the icy wind cut through the alley, but Rex did not bark or make a sound. He didn't need to alert Emily just yet. He could feel it, the weight of the responsibility on his strong shoulders. This was his moment to act, to save the innocent lives in front of him. With a soft, protective nudge, Rex positioned himself over the puppies, his large body blocking them from the harsh winds. His warmth radiated through his thick fur, creating a shield around the fragile puppies. They huddled closer to him, instinctively seeking the comfort and protection he offered. Rex lay still, his eyes scanning the empty street and the snowstorm that continued to rage. His powerful body remained tense, every muscle alert, every sense engaged as he kept watch over the tiny creatures. He would not allow them to die, not on his watch. Minutes turned to hours, the snowstorm growing fiercer by the second. Emily, inside her house, had heard Rex bark a few times earlier, but she thought nothing of it. The dog had a way of alerting her to all sorts of things. Perhaps a raccoon in the yard, or maybe another animal passing through. She had no idea that her K9 companion was already out there, fighting to keep two helpless puppies alive. But then, Rex's barking grew more urgent. It was a cry that spoke of danger, of a deep need for help. Emily's heart raced as she rushed to the door, her boots crunching on the snow as she stepped outside. She called for Rex, but his barking continued without pause, the sound more insistent now. She followed the echo of his voice, her breath visible in the air as she made her way into the alley. She had been an officer for several years, but the sight before her still took her breath away. There, beneath the shelter of Rex's protective form, were the two puppies, barely alive, their tiny bodies almost frozen from the cold. Emily knelt down beside them, her hands trembling as she reached out to scoop them up. Their fragile bodies were cold to the touch, their limbs stiff with the icy grip of winter. She gasped, her pulse quickening as she noticed something strange. On each puppy's ear was a symbol, a mark that made her stomach churn. These were not the markings of a normal animal. These were something darker, a sign of something sinister. Emily looked up at Rex, his piercing blue eyes filled with concern, but his stance unwavering. She knew, without a doubt, that Rex had saved these puppies for a reason. He had sensed their distress long before she did, and he had acted. Now, it was her turn to uncover the truth behind these markings, and to protect the lives of these innocent animals. With Rex by her side, Emily Carter had no intention of letting this mystery slide by unnoticed. She would get to the bottom of it, whatever it took. The wind continued to howl as Emily gently cradled the two puppies in her arms, their small bodies still trembling from the cold, their eyes wide and terrified. She glanced down at the strange markings on their ears, her heart sinking further with each passing moment. The symbols, a series of intricate, almost ceremonial-looking shapes, were unmistakable. Emily had seen them before, though in a different context, a darker context. The markings were associated with an underground operation she had heard rumors about, one that used animals for illicit purposes, primarily experimental research that defied all ethical boundaries. Emily carefully carried the puppies back to her house, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Rex trotted along beside her, his protective gaze never leaving the small creatures in her arms. Emily knew he understood the gravity of the situation. He had always been more than just a companion. He was her partner, her equal in every way that mattered, and he had led her straight into a web of mystery and danger. Inside, Emily rushed to a warm corner of the house and carefully set the puppies down on a blanket, covering them with a soft towel. She worked quickly, making sure they were as comfortable as possible. She had seen the devastation cold could cause, especially to such young creatures, but she had no doubt they would survive the night with the right care. The markings on their ears, though, weighed heavily on her thoughts. Rex sat by her side, his piercing blue eyes never leaving her as she worked. Emily's mind churned with questions. How had these puppies ended up in the alley? Who had left them there to die in the freezing cold? And most importantly, why were they marked in such a way? The answers weren't immediately clear, but Emily knew one thing for certain. This wasn't an accident. These puppies had been discarded, and their markings were proof that they had been part of something much larger, something far more dangerous. After tending to the puppies, Emily grabbed her phone and made a call. It was late, but there was no time to waste. She needed answers, and she knew exactly who to turn to. The call rang twice before Detective Mark Davis picked up, his voice groggy but professional. "Emily? What's going on?" he asked, clearly surprised to hear from her at this hour. "I need you to meet me at my place." "It's urgent," Emily said, her tone sharp with urgency. "I've got a lead on something, and I need you to take a look at it." "On my way," Davis replied, and the line went dead. Emily hung up and turned her attention back to the puppies. Their breathing had slowed, and they appeared to be settling down now that they were no longer at the mercy of the brutal winter storm. Rex had found a spot next to them, his large body curled protectively around them, offering warmth and safety. Emily smiled briefly at the sight before her mind returned to the mystery at hand. Detective Davis arrived within minutes, the sound of his car tires crunching over the snow outside. Emily met him at the door, and together, they headed into the living room where the puppies were resting. Davis, a seasoned investigator with a no-nonsense attitude, immediately crouched down to examine the puppies. His brow furrowed as he noticed the markings on their ears. "Where did you find them?" he asked, his voice low and careful. "An alley, just a few blocks from here. Rex found them," Emily explained, glancing at the K-9 officer who sat calmly nearby, as if he were content with his task. "They were nearly frozen to death. These markings, I don't know what to make of them." Davis examined the symbols closely, his eyes narrowing. "These aren't just random markings. This is a specific symbol. It's tied to a black market operation that's been active in this region for years." "Black market," Emily repeated, her voice edged with disbelief. "Are you telling me someone is running some kind of illegal operation with animals? For what?" Davis stood up, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "It's not just illegal. It's sickening. These symbols," he pointed to the puppy's ears. They're used by a network that's been trafficking animals for experimental research. Genetic manipulation, drug testing, you name it. They've been operating under the radar, and the authorities haven't been able to infiltrate them. They're too good at covering their tracks. Emily's heart raced as the reality of what Davis was saying sank in. This wasn't just a simple case of animal cruelty. This was something far more insidious. These puppies weren't abandoned by chance. They were part of a much larger, darker operation. One that was using innocent creatures for grotesque purposes. And the puppies? Emily asked, her voice soft with concern. What happens to them now? Now we figure out who's behind this, Davis replied grimly. We'll need to report this to the authorities, get these animals examined by a vet, and then we start tracing the source of this operation. We might be looking at a larger network than we think. As Emily processed the weight of the situation, Rex moved toward her, his muzzle nuzzling her hand, seeking reassurance. She rubbed his head absent-mindedly, but her thoughts were consumed with the puppies and the dark world they had been pulled into. This was no longer just about saving these two lives. It was about stopping a much larger evil before it could spread further. With Rex by her side and Detective Davis ready to assist, Emily knew they were on the brink of uncovering something far more dangerous than either of them could have imagined. The night seemed to stretch on forever. Emily could barely sleep, her mind consumed by the events of the past few hours. The puppies, once cold and on the brink of death, had been stabilized under her care. They had started to recover, their small bodies warming up against the soft blankets, their breathing more even. But the mark on their ears, the sinister symbols, wouldn't leave her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far larger and more dangerous. By dawn, Emily had already contacted a veterinarian to have the puppies examined. Rex, ever vigilant, lay at her side, his eyes alert and unwavering. They were a team, and they would face whatever came next together. She needed answers, and the best place to start was with the people who had been investigating underground animal trafficking. At the local police station, Detective Davis had arranged for a full briefing on the situation. The investigation into illegal animal experiments wasn't new, but it had always been difficult to get solid leads. The network behind it was elusive, operating in the shadows, always one step ahead of the law. But Emily and Rex had already uncovered a critical piece of the puzzle: the symbols on the puppy's ears. Detective Davis met her at the station, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by a seriousness that matched the gravity of the situation. "We've got a lead on a potential location," he said as they sat down at the conference table. "There's a farm outside of town, a place that's been flagged before. We've gotten reports of strange activity there, but no one has ever been able to confirm anything. If we're lucky, we'll find more answers." Emily nodded, her determination matching Davis's. "I'll go with you," she said, her voice steady. "We need to find out who's behind this. It's not just about the puppies anymore. There are more animals out there, more lives that need saving." "Agreed," Davis said, his eyes narrowing. "But we need to be careful. If this operation is as dangerous as we think, we're walking into the lion's den." Emily didn't flinch. She had been in dangerous situations before, and with Rex by her side, she knew she was never alone. Together, they were unstoppable. As they prepared to leave the station, Emily received a call from the vet. She stepped aside to take it, her pulse quickening as the words on the other end confirmed her worst fears. "Officer Carter, we've examined the puppies," the vet said, her voice low and serious. "There are traces of something in their blood. It looks like they've been subjected to some kind of experimental drug testing. This is bad. Really bad." Emily's heart sank. She had feared as much. These weren't just innocent creatures in need of a home. They were victims of a twisted experiment. What kind of drugs? What did they do to them? The vet hesitated before speaking again. "I'm not sure yet, but the signs are clear. We'll need to run more tests. But these animals have been exposed to substances that shouldn't be anywhere near them. Whatever was done to them, it's not natural." Emily swallowed hard. "Thank you. Keep me updated. I'll be in touch." When she returned to the conference room, Davis was waiting, his brow furrowed in anticipation. What did they say? The puppies were experimented on, Emily replied, her voice tight. There's no doubt about it. Someone is using animals for drug testing. Testing they shouldn't be doing. Davis's expression darkened. This is bigger than we thought. If they're testing drugs on puppies, we're looking at a whole network of illegal activity. Let's go to the farm, Emily said, her eyes steely with resolve. We're wasting time. The farm was located about 15 miles outside of town, a sprawling property with fields that stretched for miles. The sun had barely risen, and the early morning light cast a pale glow over the snow-covered landscape. It looked peaceful on the surface, but Emily knew better. She could feel the weight of something dark hanging in the air, just beneath the surface. Davis drove the police car with Emily and Rex in the back. The trip was silent except for the occasional rustle of Rex's fur as he shifted beside Emily. The K-9 officer, always alert, had a strange energy about him, as though he sensed the tension that filled the air. As they neared the farm, Emily's instincts kicked in. She could sense that something was off. The farm didn't look abandoned, but there was an eerie stillness to the place. No animals were in sight, and the barn, large and imposing, stood dark and foreboding in the distance. Davis slowed the car as they approached the entrance to the farm. We'll need to move carefully, he said. If there's anyone inside, we don't want to alert them just yet. Emily nodded, and Rex, sensing the change in the atmosphere, stood at attention. He was ready for whatever came next. They parked the car at the edge of the property, hidden behind a row of trees that offered some cover. Emily and Davis climbed out, and Rex followed them, his body moving with purpose. They crept toward the barn, staying low to the ground and keeping to the shadows. The closer they got, the more Emily's suspicions grew. The barn looked too well maintained for a place that was supposedly a hideout for criminals. She could hear faint noises, muffled voices perhaps, or the sound of equipment. It was clear that someone was inside, and they were hiding something. Davis held up his hand to signal that they should stop. He gestured toward the side of the barn, where a small door was slightly ajar. It was barely visible in the dim light, but Emily could make out the outline of a figure moving inside. Stay close, Davis whispered. We go in quiet. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as they made their way to the door, Rex's steady presence beside her. Whatever they were about to uncover, it would change everything. The small door creaked open as Emily, Rex, and Detective Davis carefully slipped inside the barn. The scent of stale hay and the faint odor of chemicals filled the air. The barn was dimly lit, the only source of illumination coming from a few flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. Emily's senses were on high alert as she moved deeper into the barn, her every step cautious but determined. She could hear the faint sounds of voices in the distance, and her gut told her they were close to the heart of whatever operation was taking place here. Rex, always the vigilant protector, moved silently by her side, his eyes scanning the shadows. He was focused, his body taut with anticipation. Emily didn't need to look at him to know that Rex was ready for whatever came next. She trusted him implicitly as she always had. Together, they had faced danger countless times, and she had no doubt that they would face whatever this dark secret held, side by side. As they continued through the barn, the noise grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just voices, they were talking about something. Conversation. Emily strained to hear, trying to make out the words. She crouched low, motioning for Davis to follow her as they moved toward the source of the sounds. They rounded a corner and found themselves facing a large metal door at the back of the barn. It was half open, just wide enough to give a glimpse of the room beyond. From what Emily could see, it looked nothing like a typical farm storage room. The walls were lined with cold, sterile equipment, large machines, glass tanks, and rows of cages. Some of the cages were empty, but others contained animals. Emily's stomach twisted as she recognized the creatures in the cages. Dogs, cats, rabbits. All of them were unnaturally still, their eyes wide and glassy. They looked sickly, weak, and terrified. Some of them had markings similar to those on the puppy's ears. The place was a nightmare, a twisted laboratory masquerading as a farm. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't just an animal trafficking ring. This was something much worse. These animals were being experimented on, subjected to unspeakable horrors, their lives reduced to nothing more than tools in a cruel and unregulated experiment. "We need to get in there," Davis whispered, his voice strained with anger. "This place is a goddamn lab. Whoever's running this is responsible for the abuse of these animals, and worse." Emily nodded grimly. "We have to stop them, before they hurt more animals." Carefully, they edged closer to the door, trying to stay out of sight. Emily's pulse raced, her body tense with anticipation. She could hear muffled voices now, a conversation between two people on the other side. It sounded like they were discussing something about a new batch of animals being brought in. The words were jumbled, but the meaning was clear. They were planning something, and it wasn't good. Davis motioned for Emily to wait as he moved forward, taking up a position near the door. He was going to take a peek inside first, to see how many people were in the room and what they were up to. Emily pressed her back against the wall, holding her breath as she waited. Suddenly, the door creaked open wider, just enough for Davis to slip inside without being noticed. Emily stayed close to the entrance, her hand on Rex's collar, ready to act at a moment's notice. What Davis saw inside made his blood run cold. The room was filled with men in lab coats, talking in low voices as they examined several of the animals. Some were hooked up to machines, wires attached to their fragile bodies. Emily's worst fears were realized. They were conducting experiments on these animals, testing unknown substances, pushing them to their limits. The lab was dark and sterile, lit only by the harsh glow of overhead lights. The smell of antiseptic and chemicals lingered in the air, mingling with the faint, sickening odor of animal urine. Davis gestured for Emily to come closer, and she silently crept forward, her hand still on Rex's collar. She peeked inside, her eyes narrowing as she took in the grim scene. It was worse than she could have imagined. These animals were not just being trafficked, they were being tortured, used as living test subjects for something far darker than she had anticipated. But as Emily's eyes swept the room, she noticed something even more disturbing. Several of the cages were empty, and there were fresh bloodstains on the floor. The people in the lab were not just testing drugs on the animals, they were experimenting with something far more dangerous. Emily could sense the urgency in the air. This operation was bigger than they had initially thought, and time was running out. "We need to get out of here," Emily whispered to Davis, her voice low and frantic. "We need backup. We can't take them down alone." Davis nodded grimly, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of movement. "You're right. We'll get to the car, call for reinforcements, and come back with a warrant. But we have to be careful. If we're caught, this whole operation could be gone before we can do anything." Emily looked at Rex, who was already alert and ready for action. The K-9 officer had sensed the tension, his muscles taut, his ears flicking at the sound of footsteps in the distance. He was prepared to fight if necessary, to protect Emily and the puppies they had saved. As Emily turned to leave, a faint noise caught her attention. A soft scuffling sound, followed by a low voice. The door to the lab was opening, and someone was about to step out. They didn't have much time. "Get back," Emily whispered urgently, pulling Davis toward the corner of the barn. Rex followed, moving with silent precision, his eyes focused on the approaching figure. The door creaked open, and one of the lab technicians stepped out, holding a clipboard in his hand. He glanced around, his eyes briefly meeting Emily's. It was too late to retreat. The technician's eyes widened in shock as he spotted Emily and Detective Davis hiding in the shadows. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The man's hand instinctively reached for his radio, but before he could make a move, Rex sprang into action. With a speed and precision honed through years of training, the German shepherd lunged, knocking the technician to the ground. The man's yelp of surprise was quickly drowned out by the growl of Rex's deep, commanding voice. "Move!" Emily shouted to Davis, pulling him along as they made a swift exit from their hiding spot. The barn was no longer a place of safety, it was a ticking time bomb, and they needed to get out before the operation could cover its tracks. Davis was quick to react, drawing his gun and positioning himself in front of Emily and Rex as they moved. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, as the other lab technicians were alerted to the intruders. The barn, once a quiet refuge, was now a chaotic mess, filled with the sound of frantic voices and the pounding of heavy boots on the wooden floor. Emily's heart raced as she scanned the area. They needed to find a way to escape, and fast. The barn was large, and the walls felt as if they were closing in on them. Rex continued to growl at the fallen technician, making it clear that he wasn't about to let anyone get close to Emily. The K-9 officer was her protector, always, and he wouldn't hesitate to neutralize any threat. "We're running out of time," Davis shouted over the noise. "We need to get to the car." But as they turned to move toward the exit, another figure appeared in front of them. A tall, imposing man with a grim expression. He was dressed in a lab coat, just like the others. But there was something about him that immediately made Emily's instincts flare. This wasn't just a technician. This was someone important, someone high up in the operation. "Stay back," Davis shouted, his gun aimed at the man. But the man merely smirked, his eyes cold and calculating. "You think you can just waltz in here and take us down?" the man said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "You have no idea what you're up against." Emily's hand tightened on Rex's leash, her eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What is this operation?" The man chuckled darkly. "You're in way over your head, officer. This is far beyond anything you can imagine. These animals—" He glanced toward the cages, where the suffering creatures were still locked away. "They're just the beginning. We're doing things here that will change the world. And you're about to get in the way." Before Emily could respond, Rex lunged again, this time at the man's legs. The technician's smug expression faltered as the German shepherd's powerful jaws closed around his ankle, dragging him to the floor. The man's cry echoed in the barn as Rex held him down, his grip unyielding. Emily didn't hesitate. With her hand still firmly gripping the leash, she moved quickly toward the door, signaling for Davis to cover her. She had no intention of letting this man get away, and with Rex holding him down, they had the advantage. But they needed to act fast. This place was teeming with people, and it was only a matter of time before reinforcements arrived. "Call for backup," Emily shouted to Davis as she approached the door. "Now!" Davis didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number for backup, his eyes scanning the barn for any other threats. Emily took a deep breath, her hand on Rex's collar as she prepared to make their move. She couldn't let the criminals get away with what they had done. She wouldn't allow these animals to suffer any longer. As Davis made the call, Emily's eyes shifted to the animals in the cages. The lab was a horror show, a testament to the cruelty and greed of the people who had orchestrated it. But she knew there was no time to free every animal right now. They had to get the authorities involved. They had to stop this operation from spreading further. The sound of sirens reached their ears, growing louder by the second. The cavalry had arrived. "Let's move," Davis shouted, holstering his gun and moving toward the exit. Emily followed closely behind, her heart still racing as she pulled Rex along. The K-9 officer trotted beside her, his eyes never leaving the downed technician, who now lay sprawled on the floor, writhing in pain. Outside, the police cars screeched to a halt as reinforcements arrived. Officers poured out, guns drawn, ready to take control of the situation. The barn, which had once seemed so ominous, was now swarming with law enforcement. The criminals were surrounded, their escape routes cut off. This operation was finally going to come to an end. Emily took a deep breath as she watched the authorities take control. Rex, by her side, stood tall and vigilant, ever the protector. The puppies, they were safe now, and so were all the other animals trapped in that hellish lab. It had been a long, dangerous night, but together, Emily and Rex had brought the criminals to justice. As the authorities moved in, Emily's thoughts turned to the future. The investigation was far from over, and there were still so many questions left unanswered. But she knew one thing for sure. She and Rex would continue to fight, continue to protect, and continue to uncover the dark secrets lurking in the shadows. Justice had been served, but this was just the beginning. The fight for the voiceless, the helpless, and the innocent would go on.